I remember this place. Edna, Texas, where the dirt roads were long, the summers were loud, and the music was the only thing that made sense. My mama used to say I carried that guitar like it was a crown. Maybe she was right. Maybe I always knew I was meant to build something bigger than the world I was born into. This little girl, she didn't have much, but she had a voice. And she had a dream. A dream to make a place where our people could breathe, where the blues could rise up like prayer, where we could be safe, even if just for one night. I didn't know it then, but this road was the start of everything. The pain, the joy, the fight, the love, the music. Everything that led me to Magnolia Bend and to the blues house. I stepped outside of the train feeling the excitement of opening my own club. I came from a town of successful Black Americans, and my grandmother, who suffered enslavement, told me to never forget the Cherokee ancestors who were forced off their land, but they built so many amazing architectures. During this time, many Black Americans added that history into their own stories, remembering how land was taken, how identity was changed on paper, and how families fought to keep what little they had. My grandmother carried all of that in her bones, and the fact that she was able to hold onto her land was a blessing. A rare victory in a world determined to erase both her blackness and her Cherokee blood. Every acre she kept felt like a piece of our ancestors she refused to let disappear. My grandmother carried a lineage the world tried to bury. She came from Cherokee ancestors who were forced off their land, pushed into new towns, and stripped of their names. Yet they still built architecture so remarkable it refused to disappear. By the time she was grown, the county no longer called her Cherokee at all. She was reclassified as Black or Negro, folded into a system that erased her identity on paper and made every step of ownership a battle. Segregation shaped her daily life, from the schools she was allowed to attend to the doors she wasn't allowed to walk through. And when she inherited that old barn, the one her father built with his own hands, white folks in the area made it clear they didn't want her to have it. They questioned her deed, challenged her right to the land, and tried to intimidate her into giving it up. But she held on to it with a strength that felt almost holy. In a time when Black Americans were losing land every day, the fact that she kept that barn was a blessing, a quiet miracle, and a piece of our ancestry she refused to let the world take. As I approached the barn, my hand felt that old wood, and I said to myself, "This is mine. I will make sure no one takes it." My grandmother's barn, the one she protected through segregation, through neighbors who didn't want a Black woman owning anything this sturdy, anything this proud. Every board carried her fight, her endurance, and the quiet blessing of land she refused to surrender. I was still tracing the grain when I heard boots scuff the dirt behind me. A cowboy stepped into the clearing, tall, dust settling around his boots like he'd walked a long way to get here. He paused at the barn door, eyes moving over the structure with a kind of respectful curiosity. "Didn't expect to see someone out here," he said, voice low and steady. "Folks say this place has been empty for years." I didn't answer right away. I let my hands stay on the wood, let my grandmother's strength settle in my chest. The cowboy shifted his hat back, studying me, then the barn. "You fixing to do something with it?" he asked. There wasn't judgment in his tone, just interest, maybe even admiration. "Be ashamed to let a place like this fall apart." His words hung in the warm air, and for a moment, it felt like the land itself was listening. The barn wasn't just a building, it was a legacy. And now someone else was standing in front of it, seeing its worth, seeing its history, seeing me. The cowboy stepped a little closer, his boots settling in the dirt like he'd decided he wasn't leaving just yet. He looked from me to the barn, then back again, studying the way my hands stayed on that old wood. "You're planning something big," he said, not as a question, but as a truth he could already see. "And I respect that. But you ought to know, this town don't take kindly to change, especially when it comes from folks they spent years trying to push out." He tipped his hat back, revealing eyes that held more concern than judgment. "I'm not here to stop you. Matter of fact, if you need a hand fixing this place up, I can spare some time. But you should be ready. Some people around here won't like seeing this barn come alive again. Not in your name. His voice settled into the quiet, steady and honest, like he wanted me to succeed, but knew exactly what kind of trouble revival could stir. It took a full year to get the barn ready. 12 long months of repairs, paint, sweat, and stubborn hope stitched into every board. Some days the work felt endless, but every time I looked at those walls, I remember my grandmother's fight to keep this place standing. And now, on opening night, lanterns glowed along the rafters, music hummed through the air, and the barn she protected had become something new. Alive, warm, and filled with people who never thought they'd see a place like this in Magnolia Bend. As I stood at the doorway, watching the crowd gather, I felt the weight of that year lift off my shoulders. This wasn't just a club, it was a resurrection. Moyola leaned against the bar, watching the crowd settle into the glow of opening night, and she smiled when Ruby stepped up to the small stage. I remember the first time I met that girl, she said, her voice low and full of pride. She was singing behind the old boarding house, just humming to herself while hanging laundry. I stopped in my tracks. Her voice didn't sound like it belonged to this town. It sounded bigger, older, like something carried through generations. I told her right then, "Baby, you don't just sing, you lift people." And tonight, hearing her fill this barn with that same voice, I knew this place was meant for her as much as it was meant for you. Ruby stepped up to the small stage, closed her eyes, and let a quiet melody slip from her lips. "Baby, I'm not done loving you. I know this must be true, and I can't stop loving you tonight." Her voice floated through the barn like warm honey, settling into every corner, every beam, every memory stitched into the wood. The crowd didn't move. They just listened, letting her sound wash over them like something sacred. In that moment, the barn wasn't just a building anymore. It was alive, carried by her voice and the hope she poured into every note. During the night, it was vibrant. Ruby's voices shining through the night. The smell of wood and country town. People laughing, drinking, and dancing. One person that would make tonight more magical was Elijah. I called him Eli. He was my childhood friend, but we were in love and agreed to see each other since I was closer to his town. When his car pulled up outside the barn, he stepped out slow, the lantern light catching the sharp line of his jaw and the easy confidence in his walk. He looked handsome in that way country men get when they've spent their lives under the sun. Clean boots, broad shoulders, and eyes that softened the moment he heard Ruby singing. Eli's voice, "Lord," he murmured as he closed the car door. That girl's voice could stop a storm in its tracks. And with that, Eli headed toward the barn, drawn in by the music, by the night, and by me. Eli stepped into the barn, the glow of lanterns catching the warmth in his eyes, and before he could take 3 steps, Moyola spotted him. "Lord, look at you," she said, opening her arms wide. Eli laughed that easy country laugh and pulled her into a hug, the kind that comes from years of knowing someone's spirit even if life kept you apart. Moyola held him tight, patting his back like a proud auntie. "Didn't think I'd see you tonight," she said, smiling up at him. Eli glanced toward the stage where Ruby stood, then back at Moyola. "Had to come," he said softly. "A voice like hers, and a night like this? I wasn't missing it." The barn seemed to warm around them, 2 familiar souls reconnecting in the middle of a place built from hope and hard work. Only 2 white men stood out in the parking lot, leaning against a dusty pickup while Ruby's voice floated through the night. They weren't celebrating. They were watching, bitter eyes fixed on the barn like it was something that didn't belong. The glow from the doorway made their shadows stretch long across the gravel, their resentment settling heavy in the warm country air. They didn't move toward the barn. Not yet. But the way they whispered in the dark made it clear they weren't just talking. They were waiting, letting their anger simmer while the celebration inside grew brighter and louder.
One of them crossed his arms and shook his head. We don't want black folks having a nice place like this. The other kicked at the gravel, glancing toward the glowing doorway. Yeah, folks around here ain't gonna let that stand.
Inside the barn, the music rolled smooth and warm. Ruby's voice drifting like honey through the rafters. Lantern light shimmered across the wooden floor, catching laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft shuffle of boots. In the middle of it all, Eli reached for Moyola's hand, and she let out a surprised laugh before he pulled her gently into a slow dance. They moved easy, familiar, like two people who'd known each other's rhythm for years. The crowd parted just enough to give them space, watching the way Moyola's dress swayed and how Eli's smile softened under the glow of the barn lights. Moyola chuckled as he spun her once. "Boy, you still dance like you did at 16. Eli grinned, holding her steady. "And you still make it look better than anybody else in the room." Their steps blended into the music, into the night, into the legacy of the barn itself. A moment of joy untouched by the shadows waiting outside. The crack of breaking glass cut through the music like a warning, sharp enough to freeze Moyola mid-step. Eli felt it too. That sudden shift in the night. The way joy thinned into something uneasy. They pushed through the crowd and rushed outside, the cool air hitting them as the barn's glow spilled across the gravel. One of the side windows had been shattered, glass scattered across the dirt like glittering shards of a broken promise. The lantern light inside poured through the jagged opening, turning the splintered edges into sharp gold. The two white men were gone, their truck tracks still fresh in the gravel. The silence they left behind heavier than any words they could have spoken. The celebration inside kept rolling, unaware, but outside the night had changed. The barn stood strong, yet the broken window made it clear that someone wanted to shake its foundation. The cowboy wasn't by the truck. He stood at the door of the club, one hand resting on the frame, his eyes fixed on the night like he'd been expecting trouble long before the glass broke. The lantern light behind him cast his silhouette across the gravel, shoulders tense, jaw set. The look of a man who'd seen this kind of hatred before and knew exactly how it moved. Eli came up beside him, the gun still in his hand, the weight of it heavy but necessary. Moyola hurried out behind them, breath tight, her dress brushing the doorway as she stepped into the cool air. The three of them stood together, the cowboy watching the darkness with a knowing ache, Eli scanning the lot with steady resolve, and Moyola trying to catch her breath as the reality settled in. The night that had been full of music now felt split open, danger lingering just beyond the glow of the barn, exactly where the cowboy had feared it would be. The club had gone quiet, the music fading into a thin echo against the rafters. Moyola stood alone near the small stage, her navy dress catching the lantern light in soft ripples. Her heels clicked once against the wooden floor as she shifted her weight, the sound swallowed quickly by the heavy silence. She held her guitar close, not to play, but because it was the only steady thing left in the room. The broken window outside lingered in her mind, sharp and cold, a reminder of how quickly joy could be shattered. The celebration that had filled the barn only minutes earlier now felt distant, replaced by a quiet fear that settled deep in her chest. She stared toward the doorway, the glow spilling in from outside, thinking about the men who had slipped into the night and the danger they carried with them. The barn stood strong, but the moment felt fragile, and Moyola stood in the middle of it, alone, steady, and hurting. Eli shifted the guitar case in his hand and stepped away from the small circle, moving toward the edge of the room like he needed space to think. The lantern light caught the tension in his shoulders, the way his breath tightened as he stared toward the broken window outside. Ruby watched him carefully, her expression softening into concern the moment he turned his back. She took a small step backward, her heels brushing the wooden floor, as if the weight of what was happening pressed her away from the center of the room. The cowboy stayed near the doorway, still scanning the darkness, but Ruby's eyes stayed locked on Eli, on the way he carried the fear, the responsibility, the need to protect everyone inside. Moyola stood alone near the stage, her guitar resting against her chest, watching the shift between them with a quiet ache. The room felt suspended, caught between the music that had filled it earlier and the danger that now lingered just beyond the door. Eli's distance, Ruby's concern, and the cowboy's vigilance formed a fragile tension in the barn. A moment where everyone understood that the night had changed and nothing would be simple from here. Ruby slipped away from the others and walked toward the back of the club. The note Wade had given her still folded between her fingers. The hallway was dimmer here, quieter, the lantern light fading into soft shadows that made every step feel heavier. She didn't rush. She just moved slowly, almost drifting, like the weight of the night was pulling her deeper into the room. When she reached the vanity table in the dressing area, she stopped, staring at her reflection for a long moment before unfolding the note again. She hadn't thought much of it earlier, brushing it off as one of Wade's odd habits, but now the words felt different. The broken window, the tension in Eli's shoulders, the cowboy's watchful silence, all of it made the message settle in her stomach like a stone. She read it again. The handwriting uneven and hurried, and the unease she'd ignored earlier rose up sharp and cold. Ruby stood there alone, the note trembling slightly in her hand, realizing Wade had seen something coming long before any of them understood.
The paper was small, creased from Wade's pocket, the handwriting uneven like he'd written it while watching something he didn't want to say aloud. Ruby unfolded in the back room, the lantern light catching the ink as she read the short, unsettling message. Be careful tonight. Some folks been talking. They don't want this place opening. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deep in Ruby's chest. A warning she hadn't understood until windows shattered and the night shifted.
Ruby moved quickly toward the sheriff, her satin dress catching the glow of the porch lights as she stepped out into the night. The street outside the blue note was alive with murmurs and nervous glances, the broken window still echoing through everyone's mind. The sheriff stood near his car, posture stiff, eyes scanning the crowd like he already knew the night had turned. Ruby approached him with the note clutched in her hand, her breath tight, her steps sharp against the wooden boards of the porch. She didn't hesitate. She stopped right in front of him, the weight of the warning pressing against her chest. The sheriff looked at her, then at the folded paper she held, and the concern in his face deepened. Ruby didn't speak. She simply handed him the note, letting the silence carry everything she couldn't say. The sheriff unfolded it slowly, reading Wade's rushed message under the dim streetlight. His jaw tightened, his eyes shifting toward the dark edges of the road where the trouble had slipped away. Ruby stood beside him, the music from inside fading into a distant hum, knowing this moment would decide what happened next. The sheriff tucked the note into his pocket, stepped forward, and the night seemed to hold its breath. Ruby didn't wait for the sheriff to act. The moment she realized he wasn't going to push harder, she stepped off the porch and went straight toward Wade, her satin robe catching the lantern light as she moved with a sharp, determined stride. Wade stood near the side of the building, hands shoved in his pockets, shoulders tense like he already knew she was coming. Ruby stopped right in front of him, the note clutched tight in her hand, her breath steady, but her eyes burning with a quiet fury. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The way she looked at him was enough to make Wade shift his weight, guilt flickering across his face before something colder settled in its place. Ruby pressed the note against his chest, forcing him to look at the warning he'd written. Wade swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he muttered something under his breath, something that made Ruby's expression sharpen even more. He admitted it, not with pride, but with a bitter shrug, saying his whole family had been talking, saying they didn't want the blue note open, saying they'd been part of the whispers that led to the broken window. The words came out twisted, shaped by the prejudice he'd grown up with, the kind that clung to him even when he looked ashamed. Ruby didn't step back. She stood her ground, her voice low and cutting, letting him know exactly how dangerous his silence had been. Wade's shoulders slumped, guilt pulling at him, but the truth hung between them like a cold wind. He felt bad, but he was still part of the problem. The porch lights flickered softly above them as Ruby turned away, leaving Wade standing alone with the weight of what he'd confessed. Word traveled fast through Magnolia Bend, faster than the sheriff's slow response and faster than Wade's guilty confession. By the next morning, the women of the church were already gathered in the sanctuary, sunlight pouring through the arched windows and warming the wooden pews. Their choir robes rustled softly as they settled in, hymn books tucked under their arms, faces set with a quiet determination. They had seen nights like this before. Nights where joy was interrupted, where progress was met with fear, where a new place like the Blue Note threatened old, hateful traditions. They weren't going to let it happen again. Miss Laverne stood at the front, hands clasped, her voice steady as she spoke about protecting the club, supporting Ruby, and making sure the Blue Note stayed open. The other women nodded, whispering among themselves, offering ideas, comfort, and plans. Some talked about organizing a watch group, others about raising money to repair the broken window, and a few insisted on cooking meals for the musicians so they wouldn't feel discouraged. The choir hummed softly, a low, warm sound that filled the sanctuary like a promise. They weren't just talking, they were preparing. The women of the church had always been the backbone of Magnolia Bend, and now they were ready to stand between the Blue Note and the danger that had crept into the night. Their voices rose together, not in song, but in unity, deciding that the club would not fall, not be intimidated, not be silenced. And in that sacred space, surrounded by stained glass and sunlight, a new kind of protection was born. One rooted in faith, community, and the fierce love they carried for their own. By late afternoon, the Blue Note was no longer quiet. The community had arrived in full force, filling the room with the steady rhythm of work and whispered determination. Men carried wooden boards across the floor, hammering them over the broken window with sharp, echoing strikes that sounded like a promise. Women moved chairs into neat rows, their hands quick and practiced, setting the room back into order as if refusing to let fear rearrange their space. The lanterns glowed warm against the wooden walls, casting soft light over faces set with purpose. On the stage, someone adjusted the microphone stand while another swept the floor, clearing away the last traces of the night before. The sign above, the Blue Note, shone like a beacon, refusing to dim even after everything that had happened. Conversations drifted through the room. Quiet encouragements, shared worries, and the kind of community resolve that only appears when people decide they will not be pushed back into silence. Outside, a few men stood guard near the porch, watching the road with steady eyes. Inside, the sound of chairs scraping, boards being nailed, and tables being set created a rhythm all its own. A preparation song, a declaration that the night would go on. The Blue Note wasn't just reopening. It was being defended, restored, and held up by the very people who believed in what it meant. By the time the sun dipped low, the club looked ready. Not just for music, but for whatever the night might bring. Magnolia Bend had gathered, and they weren't going anywhere. Night settled heavy over the Blue Note, the lanterns casting long shadows across the dusty ground as the men of Magnolia Bend took their places outside the door. They stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch and near the cars, lanterns in hand, watching the road with steady eyes. No one spoke much. The silence itself was a warning, a message that the community was ready. The air was thick with smoke from the lanterns, drifting around them like a veil, making the night feel even more tense. Then the Wade family appeared. Their trucks rolled up slow, engines rumbling low, headlights cutting through the dust. They didn't come to talk. They came to intimidate, stepping out with that familiar swagger, the kind passed down through generations of men who thought fear was a kind of inheritance. They lingered near the edge of the road, muttering, staring, waiting for someone to flinch. But no one did. The men of Magnolia Bend didn't move from their posts. They didn't raise their voices or their hands. They simply stood firm, lanterns glowing against their faces, making it clear that the Blue Note wasn't alone tonight. Behind them, the women inside kept the lights warm and the music ready, refusing to let hate silence the joy they'd built. The Wade family tried to rattle them. A few sharp words, a few threats tossed into the dark, but the community didn't budge. Their unity was louder than anything the Wades could throw at them. Eventually, the Wade men realized it. This wasn't the same Magnolia Bend they were used to. The Blue Note had people behind it, strong, steady, unafraid. And as the Wades lingered in the smoke and lantern light, the community stood together, refusing to let terror take root in their night. The night air thickened as more people stepped out of the Blue Note, drawn by the tension gathering at the edge of the road. Lanterns lifted, voices hushed, feet settling firmly in the dust. The community came forward one by one, forming a wide circle behind the men who had been standing guard. The music inside faded into a soft hum, replaced by the quiet strength of people refusing to be intimidated. The Wade family stood in the smoke, their lantern light flickering across hard faces and restless hands. They had come expecting fear, expecting the Blue Note to shrink back, expecting Ruby and Eli to fold under pressure. But instead, they found Magnolia Bend standing shoulder to shoulder, men and women alike, their expressions steady and unshaken. Someone in the crowd stepped closer, then another, and another. The circle tightened, not with violence, but with unity. A wall of people who had decided that the Wade's threats would not define their night. The lanterns glowed brighter as more hands lifted them, casting long shadows across the Wade men's boots. The music inside rose just a little, soft trumpet line drifting through the open door, like a reminder of what they were protecting. The Wades shifted uneasily. Their confidence thinned. The swagger faded. They muttered among themselves, glancing at the growing crowd, realizing that whatever power they thought they held didn't reach as far as they believed. The community wasn't backing down. Not tonight, not ever again. Finally, with a frustrated spit into the dust, the Wade men turned back toward their trucks. Engines growled. Headlights cut through the smoke, and one by one the vehicles rolled away into the darkness. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They simply watched, lanterns held high, until the last truck disappeared down the road. Only then did the community breathe again, a long, collective exhale, knowing they had stood together and won the night without lifting a single hand. The grove behind Magnolia Bend glowed like heaven had opened its hands. Sunlight poured through the tall trees, turning every leaf gold, and lanterns hung from the branches like tiny stars waiting for nightfall. Wooden benches lined the aisle, filled with the entire community, dressed in their best, smiling, whispering, holding handkerchiefs already damp with tears. At the front, beneath a flower-draped arch, Eli stood waiting. His suit was pressed, his shoulders straight, but his eyes were soft, the kind of softness a man only has when he's about to marry the woman who changed his life. Moyola stepped into the clearing, her dress flowing like water, her smile trembling with joy. The crowd hushed, leaning in as she walked toward him, each step slow and full of meaning. Before the pastor could begin, Ruby stepped forward. She held a vintage microphone, her gown shimmering in the sunlight. The musicians behind her lifted their instruments, ready but quiet. Ruby took a breath, deep, steady, and began to sing. Her voice drifted through the grove, warm and soulful, carrying every memory, every struggle, every victory that had led Moyola and Eli to this moment. It wasn't just a song. It was a blessing, a prayer, a gift from one woman to two people she loved deeply. The women of the church wiped their eyes. The men bowed their heads. Children swayed gently, mesmerized by the sound. Even the trees seemed to listen, their leaves trembling softly as Ruby's voice wrapped around them. Moyola reached Eli, tears shining in her eyes as Ruby's final note faded into the warm air. The pastor spoke, but the real ceremony lived in the way Moyola and Eli looked at each other. Steady, grateful, full of a love shaped by danger, courage, and community. When the moment came, Eli lifted her hands, leaned in, and Moyola met him halfway. Their kiss was long, warm, and full of promise. The crowd erupted, clapping, cheering, shouting with joy. The band burst into music, horns lifting the moment into celebration as Moyola laughed against Eli's chest, Ruby smiling proudly from the side. Magnolia Bend didn't just witness the wedding. They carried it. They celebrated it like it belonged to all of them. A year passed, and the Blue Note became the heartbeat of Magnolia Bend. Crowds filled the club every night. Musicians traveled from towns miles away just to play on its stage, and Ruby's name spread far beyond the county line. What started as a dream, fragile, threatened, nearly broken, grew into something powerful. Ruby became a millionaire before she even realized it. Not because she chased wealth, but because the world fell in love with the music, the atmosphere, the story of a club built by community hands and protected by courage. She used every bit of her success to lift Magnolia Bend higher. She funded new homes, restored the church, opened a school for music, and made sure every child in town had a place to learn, dance, and dream. The women of the church became her board of advisors. The men who once stood guard became her security team. The Blue Note wasn't just a club anymore. It was a legacy. And every night, Ruby and Eli walked through the doors hand in hand, still smiling like they did on their wedding day, still grateful for the community that stood with them when the world tried to shake them.
I'm not done loving you. I know this must be true and I can't